Well, I want you to hurry with me to the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 5, as we conclude this Waymaker series. Powerful series that reminds us that the very God that we read of in Scripture is alive, well, and able to do the miraculous in all of our lives. Do you believe that? Mark 5, I want to begin our reading at verse 21 and conclude at verse 24. I encourage in your quiet moments, possibly this evening or some other time in this week, to read this chapter until its conclusion, because it does constitute the context of which we shall preach on this day. But I want to read these few verses as we begin this message. And it reads like this, beginning in verse 21 in the English Standard Version. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. I want to cause us to rewind to verse 22, where it ends with this expression, "And seeing him, he fell at his feet." I want to put a tag on this text. And for the time that's ours to share on this day, I want to talk about when life brings you to your knees. When life brings you to your knees. The Gospel of Mark is one of the most exciting and intriguing. I dare to say, for me, it is my favorite gospel to read. It has a word in it that really speaks to the character of this gospel. That word is immediately. Immediately is used some 41 times in this gospel, and it speaks of the neck-breaking speed that this gospel moves with. Episode after episode, moment after moment in the ministry of Jesus, it is moving at an astonishing pace. And the reoccurring thread that we see throughout the narrative for the Gospel of Mark is that there are people who find themselves in situations that are above their heads and beyond their control. However, they have sense enough to make a beeline to Jesus, because what they understand about Jesus is that he is well able and capable to make a difference in their lives. Whether it is the miracle of those four friends who had a friend who was paralyzed, and when they could not go through the front door, their tenacity and determination was to take their paralyzed friend up onto the roof of the house and tear that roof apart to let him down before the presence of Jesus. And they saw their friend healed by Jesus, and although he was let down on a bed, he left there walking. Whether it is the story of Jesus' disciples who were walking with him, sailing across the Sea of Galilee with him, and Jesus is asleep in the stern of the ship on a pillow, and as they're sailing across, you know the story at the end of chapter 4, a storm breaks out on the Sea of Galilee, and they begin to panic because they feel like they're going down in the storm. And what they discover, that even if Jesus is asleep in the stern of the ship, I'd rather be in a storm with a sleeping Jesus than to be in a storm without Jesus. And they wake Jesus up, and Jesus gets up and speaks to the winds and the waves and says, "Peace, be still." The rain stopped falling, the wind stopped blowing, and they're able to make it safely out of the storm. And when Jesus works this miracle, they had to pause for the cause and wonder, what manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? We journey on over to chapter 5 as the gospel continues to move. They make it through the storm, but when they get to the other side of the shore, while they had just come out of a storm, they encounter a man who has a storm raging on the inside of him. The text just says that he has an unclean spirit. He is demon possessed. He finds himself living on the margins of the community, not in a gated community, but in a cemetery. Nobody wants to deal with him. They tried to shackle him, but the chains could not hold him. All day and all night, he is screaming and hollering in this cemetery. He is mutilating himself by cutting himself on rocks, but even a demoniac had sense enough to find their way to Jesus Christ. And when they get to Jesus, Jesus brings about a deliverance, so much so that when the people saw this man who was once demon possessed, clothed and in his right mind, they were afraid. And then we happen upon verse 21 of this gospel, Mark chapter 5. And it's here yet again that we are reminded that whenever we find ourselves in a predicament that has knocked the wind out of us, knocked us down to our knees, if we could just find our way to Jesus, Jesus can make the difference in our lives. And there's some of you possibly in this place, possibly you're watching online, and you're saying, this message doesn't apply to me. You're saying, my life is good. Relationships are strong. My job is secure. The same money I went to bed last night in my bank is the same money I woke up with when I woke up this morning. And so I don't know what this message has to do with me, but growing up in the church, the old mothers with the white hats on and the white suits would say something like this: just keep on living. Sooner or later, your life will encounter a great difficulty that will bring you to your knees. As I survey the archives of my own life experience and pastoral ministry, I'm reminded of episodes of people who have been brought to their knees. Remember the rising young executive sister who had a bright and promising future, thought she was building a future with a particular gentleman, had procured living arrangements for them, had furnished a home completely, only to discover that that gentleman was moving in, and he was not going to be moving in with her. He's going to be moving in with his fiance. Life brought her to her knees. Or for those who've been in the exam room at a routine physical examination with their physician, and to have the physician walk in with a grave look on their face and to announce to them a debilitating diagnosis for which there are no proven treatments, for their only experimental treatments. Life has brought them to their knees. I don't possibly have to drive down your street or bowl down your alley, but I want to tell you, life can bring you to your knees. But take heart today. Jairus will be a case study for us, that if life has brought you to your knees, we serve a God that we've sang about, that we've talked about, who is in fact a way maker, who will show you time and time again when life puts you in a situation where you think there is no way out, God is still able to make a way where it seemed there is no way. Jairus brings us to the reality, sisters and brothers, as he is the ruler of the synagogue. In modern language, it would mean he is the president of the synagogue. He has been appointed by the elders of the synagogue to be the one who will administrate the facility. He has the responsibility of the upkeep as well as the planning of services that will take place in the synagogue. He's a man with influence, with prominence. He has clout. He has respect respect. People revere him. But what we learn in this episode is that it does not matter your status. None of us will get an exemption from going through trouble, having an encounter with tragedy, or going through a trial in your life. But brothers and sisters, I want to encourage you, if that's you on today, rush to Jesus. And when you rush to Jesus, he will prove that he is able to make the difference in your life. This text is tailored to teach us, brothers and sisters, that God uses whatever has brought you down as an occasion for you to witness God turn your situation around and raise someone up. This text will teach us what that British statesman would say, Winston Churchill. He would say, never waste a crisis. I want to contend today that our God never wastes a crisis. God never arbitrarily allows you and I to go through a moment or a season of suffering. God has intention and purpose not only to bring about good out of a bad situation, but God will have intention and purpose so much so that he will use your crisis as an opportunity to bring glory to him. And is there anybody in the building today that is glad that we serve a God who is able to take the canvas of our crisis and paint a masterpiece for his glory? If life has brought you to your knees, this text teaches us that at your weakest, that's where God is working. Buckle up your seatbelts. Let's ride for a moment. Other side of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus is welcomed by this demon-possessed man. But when they sail across back to the other side, to the headquarters of his ministry, Capernaum, people are waiting for Jesus. And in this crowd that's waiting for Jesus, there's that man by the name of Jairus. And when Jairus sees Jesus disembarking the vessel, he runs immediately to Jesus and falls at his feet, because whereas he may have been a man of influence and prominence, he was not powerful enough to heal his sick daughter. He is at his wits end. He is at his weakest, and we do not know his daughter's condition specifically. All we know is what the gospel writer puts there, is that the daughter is sick and near death. We don't know what the diagnosis is. Possibly there was no diagnosis. Maybe they had gone to the medical community in Capernaum and there was not a cure for what she was dealing with. That would make sense, because there is a woman that we'll read about further down in this same chapter whose story is sandwiched between the opening and the outcome of Jairus' story and his daughter. And this woman had spent all that she had by going to doctor after doctor, and her condition didn't get any better. As a matter of fact, it became worse. There was no St. Jude Children's Hospital to take his daughter to bring about a healing. She lies at home at the point of death. And sisters and brothers, her condition is precarious. The prognosis is doubtful. The outlook is dim. And in a fit of desperation, all that Jairus can think to do was to find Jesus and fall at his feet and make the request of Jesus, come to my house, lay your hands on my sick daughter so that she may be made well and live. He is clearly at his lowest. He is at his weakest. But little does he know that at his weakest is where God is working. I need you to hear me this morning. This is so important. And what we learn from his life is that when we are brought to our knees, that's exactly where God wants us to be. It's at that place of having done all you can. after having exhausting every other means of resolving your predicament, where there's nothing left to do, no alternatives to consider, where God begins to work, because it's at that place where you cannot do anything else, where all you can do is put your trust in God. And sadly, that is seldom where many of us want to be. At a place where all you can do is trust in God, because if you are honest, and you ain't got to raise your hand, but if you are honest, we like to control the outcomes in our life. We rely on being able to pick up the cell phone or send a text message to somebody with a resolution to our crisis, or we depend on our own intellect and our ingenuity to try to get ourselves out of what we found ourselves in. And so we despise being in a place where we feel that we are helpless and powerless. However, when you get to a place in relationship with God where you feel that you are helpless and powerless, that is exactly where not only God wants you to be, but where we need to be. It is at that place that we come to of ultimate trust and surrender that God is at work in our lives. Too many of us are running the risk of running our lives off the road. God has only called us in this life to ride shotgun. And too many of us are riding shotgun, reaching over into the driver's seat, trying to take the steering wheel. And if you're honest, that's why some of us have ended up out in a ditch. Because God wanted us to just ride shotgun, but we're trying to reach over and take the wheel from him instead of letting God have his way to lead us and guide us into his good purposes for our lives. We have to get to the point as we walk with God, in relationship with God, that we are okay coming to the point where we feel weak. Paul would help us. You read it. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning in verse 7, Paul begins to tell of an experience that, as great as he was, author of half the New Testament, has evangelized many, has mentored others in ministry. He had gone to the third heaven, seen and heard things that mere mortals just don't experience. But as great as his life was, as some of our neatly curated presences on social media, Paul had to be honest and say, I've got a thorn in my flesh. And I've had to live with this thorn no matter how earnest my prayer life was. He said, I prayed about it once, but the thorn was still there. I prayed about it again, thorn didn't leave. Prayed about it again, God didn't take the thorn away. He felt that God either had said no or didn't say anything at all. He was at his weakest, but Jesus speaks to him. And Jesus said to him, in the midst of being weak with dealing with this thorn, Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. That's what I'm trying to tell somebody today. It's okay to be weak, because if you've got God, God says, even when you're weak, that's when you will be strong, because that allows God to work even in the midst of your weakness. And I want to challenge you today. Don't obsess yourself with trying to figure it all out or work it out or reach out to a contact to make it work out for you. Our God is more than able, when we get to our weakest, to begin working on our behalf. Y'all ain't feeling me like I need you to. I'm reminded of a familiar story. So if you've heard it before, act like you heard it for the first time. Chinese clergyman Watchman KN tells the story of a young lad who was on a sweltering summer day swimming in the lake. And while he was enjoying himself, so much so, he had lost a sense of how far he was from the shore. And when he recognized how far he was from the shore, he began to panic. And this boy, who clearly could swim himself, clearly could float, it fails him in that moment, and he just begins to flail his arms around, trying to stay above water. Good news, his lifeguard saw him, swims out to save him, but doesn't go in immediately to rescue him. The boy continues to flail and fight to stay above the water. The lifeguard still doesn't go in to save him. And then it is at the moment where the boy couldn't struggle anymore, where he had become weak, where he was getting ready to go under, that moment the lifeguard swooped in, rescued him, and helped him swim back to shore. When they got back to shore, there was a crowd of onlookers who had become upset. They had a critique of the lifeguard and his rescue methodology. They said, "Why did you take so long to go in and save this boy? What was it that caused you to wait while he struggled before your very eyes and never go in and save him?" And the lifeguard could only take it so much longer. And so he stood up and looked at this crowd of onlookers and said, "If I would have gone in immediately while he was flailing his arms and try to rescue him, he not only would have gone under himself, but he would have taken me under too, because he had too much strength. And so I allowed him to struggle until he lost some strength and became weak, so as at that moment I could rescue him and take him back to safety." Maybe that's what God is doing in some of our lives right now. God is letting you struggle a little while and flail your arms a little while so that you'll become weak enough to put all of your trust and confidence in God, who you said makes ways. Yes, Lord. When there is no way, when life brings you to your knees, it's not only at your weakest where God is working, but here's the second thing I need you to know. You have to keep walking even when the wait turns out for the worse. Jesus finally consents to go with Jairus to his house to see about his sick daughter. And while they're walking along, Jairus has a little optimism. Jesus is on his way to my house. But while on the way to the house, a crowd is all around them. And in the midst of this crowd, there is this sister, who I referenced earlier in this message, this unnamed woman who had an issue of blood for 12 years. She's in this crowd, and y'all, she's got a crazy faith. She's convinced herself, Jesus ain't got to speak a word to me. He doesn't have to lay his hands on me. If I could just touch something that's touched him, I'll be made whole. And so she made up her mind to press through the crowd, because she said, if I could just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be made whole. And y'all, this woman who had struggled with this condition for 12 years, in an instant gets healed. What did that say about our Waymaker? And as we celebrate the fact that God in an instant can heal something that you've been struggling with for 12 years, we can't help but be concerned about Jairus. Remember, his daughter is still at the house, sick and near death. And he has had to be held up and detained while Jesus dealt with this woman who had this issue of blood, who gets healed in an instant while they're on their way to his house to heal his sick daughter. Y'all, what Jairus teaches us is that we have to develop a maturity in being able to watch God bless someone else ahead of us while we're still waiting for God to come through on our behalf. Come on, at least nod at me. Some of you here today, you're always the bridesmaid, never the bride, always the groomsman, never the groom. You are the dutiful employee at your place of work, and yet you always get skipped over when it comes to promotions. Christian maturity is being able not to become bitter, but to trust that the same God who has blessed them is able sooner or later to come through on your behalf. Time runs out on Jairus. While they're walking, while they're waiting, while they're still in the euphoria of this woman who has been healed of her condition, word comes from Jairus' house. Jairus, your daughter, who's been sick and near death, I regret to inform you, she has died. They go on to say, matter of fact, not only has she died, through what they say, they believe there is no possibility for a miracle. So don't trouble Jesus any longer. Jesus looks at Jairus. Don't fear, only believe. And they kept walking towards Jairus' house. Isn't that amazing? They received the devastating news of the death of Jairus' daughter. That's the occasion, the reason why they were heading to his house, because Jesus was supposed to be the one that was going to lay his hands on his daughter so that she can be made well and live. But now she's dead, but yet they keep walking. Jesus has told them, don't fear, only believe. It is almost as if Jairus is walking with Jesus, not because he's trusting Jesus to give him words of comfort to deal with the death of his daughter. And Jesus is walking with Jairus, not because he wants to be there as a support and a source of consolation. I believe Jairus keeps on walking out in faith, that regardless of what I may have heard about the condition of my daughter, God says to me, believe. And so I'm going to keep walking by faith, not by sight or not by what I hear. My brothers and my sisters, as you and I walk with God on the pathway of Christian discipleship and our bad situations go to worse, we have to develop a capacity to keep walking with God that is not based upon what we have heard or based upon what we see, but trusting in what God has said. God in Christ says to Jairus, don't fear in the face of death, only believe. There will come a point in your life that the stuff that we hear when we come and worship, we've got to walk out in our own life's experience. We've heard our young people encourage us on today and remind us of Romans 8:28. All things work together for the good of them that love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. We've recited Jeremiah 29:11 that reminds us time and time again that God knows the plans that he has for us, plans to prosper us, not to harm us, to give us a hope and a future. Well, if you can shout about it when you come to worship, you've got to learn how to walk it out when you leave here and keep walking with God even when the wait turns out for the worse. We saw this on Friday. Yeah, we saw it on Friday. I know I'm in the Dallas area, and y'all's homegirl showed out on the world stage. Shakari Richardson, I had great hopes for her in these Paris games that she was going to win the gold in 100 meters. I like her swag. Sister got it going on. After not being able to compete in Tokyo, when she began to make her way and prepare for these Olympic Games, she had to set the record straight with the press and let them know, I'm not back, I'm better. And so heat by heat, race by race, competition after competition, she is dusting the field and she gets to Paris. I am certain, I am sure she's going to win the gold in the 100 meter. But to my disappointment, she didn't win gold, she won silver. She had the capacity, the ability to win gold, but yet she won silver. But on Friday, she was part of a team of 4 sisters. She was the anchor of this team. But y'all, on the day of the race, something happened that turned for the worse. Paris had it forecasted for precipitation. And so before the race began, before the gun was fired, a storm happened. And yet the race went on as planned. Y'all, this is a relay. Rain is going to make it difficult to pass the baton from one runner to the other, and not to mention keeping your footing on a slippery track. But y'all, these 4 showed us that you can still win the gold if you can learn how to run through a storm. That's somebody's word in here today. It's a storm in your life. Life has become difficult, but keep moving forward until you make it to what God has promised you. Here's the final thing, that God will work beyond our wants to accomplish his will. Don't tune me out. Tune in just for a few more moments. They finally make it to the house. And when they get to the house, mourning is in full swing. In that day and time, the funeral industry was booming. You could not only, get something to bury your loved one in and, get transportation and get all that stuff to prepare the body for burial, but you can also throw in some professional mourners. And so they had some professional mourners at the house who were there to accentuate the grief. And when Jesus walks in, Jesus begins to speak in a way that seems crazy considering the fact that the daughter has died. Jesus looks at all this carrying on going on, and you know who you can be when your loved one died. And he says, she's not dead, she's asleep. And watch this. These mourners cut off the crying and begin to laugh. It shows us they're not there out of care or concern, but in some way they benefit from the misery. Can we lean in for a moment? That if you are to witness God do something miraculous in your life, you better watch the company that you keep. Not everybody who you think is showing up for you is for you. Some people who say they're showing up for you are showing up because they want a front row seat to your misery. And you've got to learn to do what Jesus did. Jesus put all them folk out and took with him the folk who had faith. He said, she sleep. That sounds crazy talk. That's crazy faith. And when he says sleep, that's not some Christian euphemism as it's used in other places in the Bible to speak of death. Jesus is speaking the language of divine possibility. That if she is just sleep, that means the possibility of her waking up is still in the cards. And my brothers and my sisters, what we learn in this moment, as we navigate through the rest of these gospels, that although Jairus' want was for Jesus to come, lay his hands on his sick daughter so that she may be made well and live, that wasn't God's will. God, although Jairus had a plan for healing, Jesus wanted a resurrection to take place. He's showing us where earlier in this gospel, at the healing of the paralytic, he shows his power over sickness. It is in the storm that we learn God's power over creation. It is with the demoniac that we see God's power over evil. But here, at the raising of Jairus' daughter, we learn God's power over death. Hear me today, brothers and sisters. This is a preview of a coming attraction. That a few years are going to pass. Jesus is going to walk the Via Dolorosa, go to Calvary, die on a cross, be buried in Joseph's new tomb. But early Sunday morning, he's going to get up and demonstrate once and for all that he's taken the sting out of death and victory out of the grave. Because resurrection shows us that God has conquered life's most formidable foe. That if God can overcome death, there's nothing that you can face with God that he cannot make a way out of. So if you're frustrated today because our desires conflict with God's design, or our wants are not in alignment with God's will, know that God is sovereign and God responds as God wills, because as I've said earlier, God not only wants to bring good in your life, God is also determined to get glory out of the situation that you're going through. If life has brought you to your knees, don't resign to it. Know that your current condition is not your conclusion. So as I close this message, won't you just nudge your neighbor and wake them up so they can leave here today and have something to tell people they learn while they were in church? Story is told and is captured in a 2016 Washington Post article that in 2015, a woman of African descent who lived in Australia with her husband boarded a flight to go back to her native country, Burundi, for a funeral of a family member. When she arrives home in Burundi, she is immediately abducted by a gang. She's taken to an abandoned warehouse. She is bound to a chair. And as these gang members begin to talk, they begin to talk about how her own husband had put a hit out on her life. So when the gang leader walks in, he asks before they execute this woman who put the hit out on her life. Gang leader waits for an answer, and they tell him that her own husband did so. So he made the decision to say, we're not going to kill her. We're going to let her go and just keep his money. She is saved in that instant, but back in Australia, her husband has told everybody that she's died in a horrible accident. He begins to plan her memorial. But as everyone assumes that his wife is dead, she slips back into the country. Doesn't tell anybody that she's back. She makes her way to the church to talk to the pastor. Tells her pastor what has happened, that on her trip away to be at another loved one's funeral, her husband had put a hit out on her life. But she tells the pastor, go on with the memorial service that they have planned. And so the memorial service is planned. You know, they weep, they were wailing. They'd got through the service and they had that good old repast food. Fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, green beans with a piece of pound cake, and some sweet tea that'll shoot your blood sugar all the way up. Everybody had left for this sad occasion, and the husband was there all alone, standing in the parking lot, when someone taps him on the shoulder, and he turns around, and there his wife stands, and she says, "Surprise, I'm still alive." Listen, life may have knocked you down. Life may be planning for you to have an unfortunate conclusion, but we serve a God who's able to overcome any circumstance, take the sting out of death, and allow us to look back at life and say, "Surprise, I'm still alive." Is there anybody here today who can shout today because you've had God make ways for you when other folk had given up on you, and you came in here to one community church to look back at the devil and say, "Surprise, I'm still alive." What you meant for evil, God turned it around for good. Why don't you high five your neighbor and tell your neighbor, "Surprise, I'm still alive."